particularly women, that there's kind of this notion that women's bodies are supposed to, once they're an adult, they're supposed to stay fixed. And then completely ignoring the fact that our bodies are going to change tremendously over our life course. And yeah, I think that because we have so little representation too, especially of older women in media and even in positions of power, right? That we as women don't get to see other women who are older. And oftentimes even the ones that we do nowadays, if they're a celebrity, they most likely have had some sort of cosmetic procedures or surgeries.
Hello, welcome to the Open Notes podcast. Our study group includes me, Kiana Gerhart, and Angela Thompson. Our guest today is Jeannine Gailey, professor and researcher on the sociology of the body and fat studies. Her career has spanned worlds of sociology, qualitative studies, and research and advocacy. Grab a snack and your notebook and let's get ready to study. Our first question today is, can you introduce yourself and how did this affect who you became?
I'm Jeannine Gailey, and I'm a professor of sociology. I think that I really came to this role, especially studying the body and particularly body image issues and fat studies, because of the way in which my grandmother and my mother responded to their own bodies and mine. There was a lot of emphasis on appearance from the time that I was very young. And unfortunately, a lot of my self value and worth was in my appearance. And being able to find sociology, especially at the postgraduate level, and really doing that work and starting to learn the ways in which systems and structures shape our individual experiences really enabled me to then start to interrogate why perhaps they were so focused on appearance and just how appearance in our society is so incredibly important. And so it just enabled me to go down these routes that I probably would not have gone otherwise. And it's been just really empowering in many respects. But also, I think the biggest thing that I found is that people tell me that the stuff that I write and or even assign in classes helps them. And that to me is something that I think, just growing up with mental illness in my family and things like that, this kind of ability to help others and help them, especially with things that are both individual but also structurally created, has been just a really one of my greatest joys actually in my life.
And you know what's interesting, or what I have found with interviewing people for this past year, is so many people's work is informed by their life experience, by what they experienced growing up or in their younger self. When I started doing wedding research because I called off a wedding. That was the ding 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 moment. Okay, I canceled my own wedding. Now let's look at this industry. And it's just incredible to me the number of people who their background has really informed their life experience. Um, what do you like most about your work, and what do you find most challenging about your work?
Oh, the thing I like most about my work, if we're talking about my research, that it's definitely interacting with participants. I just love doing in-depth interviews and just really getting to listen to someone and try to understand their perspective and their worldview. As far as teaching, I think that it's such an honor, I think, to be able to work with students and to be able to help guide them on their journey through college. They're so curious and they're often just such a delight to help them navigate the process of learning and growing up, really.
So, I think to start off the interview or the specific questions, I think would be a good thing to talk about health and how you would explain health, if that makes sense.
Okay.
Since public opinion, I feel, is very focused on what healthy looks like.
Yeah, we tend to, in our society, assume that we can tell if someone is healthy by looking at them. And this is incredibly problematic because most of the time, if we have an ailment or an illness and so forth, it's not going to show necessarily on our outward body. But we tend to, as, again, as a society, tend to believe that people who are thin and who are somewhat conventionally attractive, that they are healthier than people who are in maybe larger bodies or who might not meet the demands or the current trends within appearance. And health is what I find in my research is that a lot of participants themselves equate their health with their weight. And in one of my most recent publications, it was about that specifically, that these baby boomer women were really worried about the fact that they had gained a little bit of weight. Most of them were really rather thin, and by all intents and purposes, in the medical community, standards would have been considered like within a healthy weight range, but they still having more weight on their bodies than they had previously. And then hearing the messaging surrounding the obesity epidemic and really just how frequently I think we hear messaging about how harmful fat is, that even just gaining 5 to 10 pounds, right, became something that they were really concerned that this was going to increase their risk of diabetes or heart disease or what have you. And we know, of course, in some populations that that could be the case, right? But typically these like really minor variations in weight are not going to significantly impact our health, but that equation is often very present.
Is there a disconnect between our understanding of our bodies and the aging process? So, what comes to mind is I am postmenopausal at this point in life. I mean, I used to be able to drop weight in a heartbeat. Now, on many level, I don't care in the same way. And I think that is accepting aging and how my body just is working differently than it is before. I broadly speaking, our society isn't particularly pro aging. And so how does this impact our perception of ourselves?
Yeah, I mean, the messaging is that, first of all, we're not supposed to age, particularly women, that there's kind of this notion that women's bodies are supposed to, once they're an adult, they're supposed to stay fixed. And then completely ignoring the fact that our bodies are going to change tremendously over our life course. And yeah, I think that because we have so little representation too, especially of older women in media and even in positions of power, right? That we as women don't get to see other women who are older. And oftentimes even the ones that we do nowadays, if they're a celebrity, they most likely have had some sort of cosmetic procedures or surgeries. And what we're seeing isn't even then really the natural kind of aging process taking place on their bodies. And so I think that it becomes, we look in the mirror and we look different than we expect because we think that we still feel young inside, right? I still feel like I'm 30 in my brain, but I look in the mirror and I'm like, oh, wait, not 30 anymore. And so that disconnect, I think, is really pronounced and becomes really, I think, challenging for a lot of women, again, especially to navigate because of these expectations that women are supposed to be young and conventionally attractive and so forth.
That's that's super sad and shocking to hear. And it kind of like puts you in the down because it feels like looking at your research, it is a lot of the things. The expectations on women are really harsh. And in one of your articles, I think it was that I don't eat that much with baby boomers' fear of weight gain, you use the phrase body for others. So,
Mhm.
What conclusions and reasons did you find when asking women if they tied their value and worth to their weight?
Yeah, I'd say at this point in my career, I've probably interviewed around 200 women. And so one of the things that has come up, regardless of the actual topic of the study, has been just how much their own sense of self and their own view of their bodies and their appearance has been shaped by significant people in their lives, primarily our parents, right? But grandparents, significant others, spouses, and so forth. And one of the things actually that I'm playing with right now is thinking about working on a book that kind of brings together all of my research and really focusing on how so many of these women have framed their dissatisfaction with their appearance as being like a letdown, a letdown to not just themselves, but a letdown to their spouse or even their parents. I talked with women who were in their 60s who still felt like they were not living up to the standards that their mom or dad had set for them. And their parents oftentimes weren't even still living. But there was still this feeling that they were like letting them down. But then there's also been this theme that has come up about that they're letting society down. And that because there is so much pressure on women to appear, again, thin, conventionally attractive, et cetera, that 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 when we don't, or even if we might even meet those expectations, but we don't feel we do. And when we feel that way, we often are feeling like we're letting down our colleagues, we're letting down our students, we're letting down whomever it may be, that we're not living up to expectations that our family, friends, society has for us. And you're right, it is really sad. And that's probably one of the hardest parts of my work is just how depressing it can be, which is why, again, I think that when I'm ending an interview or something like that, and we turn off the recording and the woman says something like, "Oh my gosh, this was so nice," or "It was so great to talk about these things. I never get to talk about this stuff," or "Nobody ever wants to listen to these sorts of things," and they feel like they've been seen and heard. I think that's just been such a gift that I didn't expect that would come out of these really difficult conversations.
And what's interesting and fascinating to me about this topic is even if a woman has attained an incredible level of success, the question often comes back down to her weight.
Mm.
Who comes to mind is Oprah. After it was announced she was a billionaire and all this other stuff, I had a conversation with someone and they're like, she could just keep her weight under control. And I'm like, she's a billionaire. What are you? This that it still came back to that conversation, which doesn't matter how much you achieve, how successful you are. If you don't fit the image, then you still haven't really accomplished something. Which nobody's asking how much does Warren Buffett weigh or you know
Mm.
how much does Bill Gates weigh. It was still a question of what did Oprah weigh, and I found that so incredibly disturbing.
Yeah, and I it's just thinking back over her shows over the years, right? I just
Yes.
remember how many of them were focused on dieting and things like that. Like
Mm,
that famous scene where she's rolling out that thing of all that meat to
yes.
demonstrate what like 5 pounds looked like, or I can't remember
Mhm.
exactly what it was, but
Yes.
and just yeah, it's it just goes to show though, I think that how much value is placed in our society on women's in particular appearance, and not just their appearance but their body size, and these expectations about you're supposed to have breasts or buttocks and so forth, but then you're
Mhm.
supposed to have this teeny tiny little waist and thin legs and so forth, and it's very few people in the world are actually born with a body that looks like that. But yeah, so even Oprah is unable to escape these demands. And it's when you hear her interviewed even about things regarding her
Mhm.
weight, you hear these echoes of some of the things I was just saying a little bit ago about this idea of kind of like letting people down or letting the world down, right? Because she didn't keep the weight off or something. Yeah.
Is this so accepting that our perspective and the European approach and perspective is very similar to this? How does this vary with other cultures? In Asian cultures and African cultures,
Mhm.
do they take a different uh, approach, or are the pressures still the same?
Yeah. One of the things that, especially when I first started studying weight studies and particularly trying to understand the difficulties that women in larger bodies experience in our society, one of the things that field was often criticized for was that it was very US specific, right? And thankfully over the last 20 years or so, this subfield has really grown, and so we do now have more information about other cultures around the world. And what it just really depends. I was on a panel one time with a woman from Taiwan, and even BMI, the metrics for BMI, which I think is a terrible measure, but nonetheless, even those were different than ours. And I don't know if you all know this, but in around 1997, they changed the standards for body mass index. It used to be, so it's 18 to 24.99 is considered normal, right? And then 25 to 29.99 is considered overweight. It used to be that the normal weight went to 27. And yeah, and so literally overnight in like 1997, all of these people woke up to being all of a sudden overweight or obese. But my point on that is this woman from Taiwan, she was sharing about her data and so forth. And the BMI expectations were even more stringent than they are here. And there was a lot more emphasis on thinness. And what I've found with women, Asian American women I've interviewed, is that they hold a lot of those expectations, right? This idea that the quote unquote, archetype that we have for an Asian woman is that she's small and frail even, right? As opposed to other places in the world where we may see fatness more celebrated and larger bodies celebrated. Interestingly, though, what you tend to see is that the almost like the gross domestic product of a country determines the weight standards of that country. So, for instance, in Fiji, until the early 1990s, the most beautiful bodies were large bodies. And this really had a lot to do with the fact that to have a larger body meant that not only were you able to get hard work done, but it meant you could eat, right? And that you had extra food, which was something that was not commonplace. And around the early to mid 1990s, Fiji went through this process of electrification. Um, the Western influences, like with television and so forth, were infiltrated on the island. And there just happened to be an anthropologist whose name is escaping me at the moment. I feel terrible about that. But she happened to be in Fiji and she was studying teen girls. And she was there for this 3-year period of time. And never in a million years did she imagine that she was going to be studying eating disorders in Fiji. But that is exactly what happened. And and so as Western influence and as the economy started to shift to an economy that was not agrarian, but was rather one where they were like call centers and kind of like pink collar type work, the girls were looking at these images of women that they were seeing on Western television, and they were like, I don't look like that. If I don't look like that, I'm not going to be able to get a job. And so this shift had happened almost like overnight, right? Where all of a sudden the beauty standard had gone from this more voluptuous, larger body to this kind of Western standard of a very thin um, frame. And we have that. But then, so it's, I don't want to overgeneralize because even within Africa, there are so many countries within Africa that have different standards with regard to body size and shape. Though we do know that there are perhaps maybe a little bit more generous standards in most African countries with regard to body size, because we also know that people with African descent tend to be healthier at larger body sizes. And that's probably has a lot to do with it. But otherwise, yeah, in kind of countries that we see moving into more of a privileged society or more kind of like white collar type work, we tend to see that an emphasis on smaller bodies.
When you said that, I got taken back to my time in South Korea. I studied there for 4.5 years, and I think the moment I landed, I immediately thought, oh my gosh, I'm huge. Because the way the tables are set up, you have to be smaller in a way not to bump into anyone, or the way the stores are set up, there was no clothes in my size. And it was so depressing to see like when I sit down on a subway seat, I took up more of the seat than maybe a woman who was from South Korea who did the same. I think I remember I was I went to the doctor once and I already lost quite a lot of weight because I was super depressed. And the doctor said, "No, you need to like just eat one meal a day because you're too big." And I was already eating like one meal a day. So in a way it was like, "Oh, so I shouldn't eat at all then because I don't fit this standard that I need to look beautiful or to look healthy." So it was very depressing to like go to these stores or talk to my friends and you know what, you'll never fit in this society unless you're smaller, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I'm sorry you went through that. I've heard, I remember very clearly this woman that I interviewed who was Brazilian American. She actually was one of our students. And then I interviewed her after she'd graduated years later. But she talked about the first time she went to Brazil because she was born in the US. First time she went to Brazil with her family, and she thinks she was around 10 or 12 years old or something. And she was a bit bigger, and just the way in which her extended family treated her. They were very hostile about her weight. And she shared that people, even strangers on like the bus, would say things about people's bodies. You're too fat, right? And I'm just like, oh my gosh, I can't even imagine having that happen. And she's standing in front of this table of physicians, this conference table of physicians, and they had her body up on a screen and they marked every single part of her body for being problematic. And then they would go in and perform plastic surgery on her from head to toe. And you would see her then completely covered in bandages, right? And going through and then they would reveal her.